Everybody, welcome to Russia. I don't know where you are, but we have 16 inches of snow on the ground here. So it feels very appropriate to be reading this book today. I'll turn it over to Roxana.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, welcome to Russia. We have great drifts in the snow, so it feels Tolstoyan, this landscape. Before I begin, I want to just say something about this process, this event that we started at the Cornwall Library. We started it last spring in the midst of COVID in an effort to create a sense of community at a time when we were all sort of trapped in our houses and uncertain about the future and maybe feeling anxious, even frightened. And so we wanted to give people a place to gather and a place to think about something besides the national situation. So at that time, it was very small. It was really only Cornwall people who were part of it. This winter, I started it again, thinking that we would still just be reaching Cornwall, but this book is so popular. It has reached such a wide audience, which thrills us, but it's also meant that we've had to add some staff and we need a little more support. So we are taking a leaf from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we are going to recommend a donation every week of $20. We're hoping that will appear on the next time you get a link reminding you about the program. If that's in your budget, we would be very, very grateful if you could donate. If it's not in your budget, we want you to stay. You're very, very welcome here. This is for a community. So, and thanks to all of you who've already made donations. You know who you are, and we know who you are, so thank you. Okay, so this is session 4, February 2nd. And remember that we're looking at 3 characteristics in this book: velocity, intensity, and empathy. And there are a number of themes that we've been noticing and that we're going to continue to examine: marriage, adultery, family, morality, and nature. And there's another question that I want you to consider that I think was very much on Tolstoy's mind. And that is the question, how to live your life as a man, how a man should live his life. And these are not themes. Tolstoy didn't have a 3-ring binder and he wrote at the top of it, here are the themes I want to deal with. These are things that drove him to search and explore. These are things that confused and troubled him and things he needed to work out in his own mind. So he chose the novel as a vehicle for exploration. So he talks about these things over and over again, and we're fortunate to be part of his exploration. So this time I'm going to read about nature. This is the first thing that comes up in this section for me. And this is Levin and the mowing scenes. So I'm going to start on page 249 for anyone who wants to follow me. And I skip around, so I apologize, but I'm starting on 249. Levin took the sigh, then began to get the feel of it. Their swaths finished, the sweaty and cheerful mowers came out on the road, one after another, chuckling and greeting the master. They all gazed at him, but nobody said anything until a tall old man with a wrinkled, beardless face in a sheepskin coat came out on the road and addressed him. "Watch out, master. Once you start, there's no stopping," he said. And Levin heard repressed laughter among the mowers. I'm skipping it then. So no, I'm not skipping. I'll try to keep up, he said, and taking a stand behind Titus and waiting for the moment to start. Titus cleared his place and Levin followed him. The grass near the road was low, and Levin, who had done no mowing for a long time and was embarrassed by the looks directed at him, mowed poorly for the first few minutes, though he swung strongly. Voices were heard behind him. "It's not hafted right, the handle's too long. See how he has to bend," one voice said. "Bear down on the heel," said another. The grass became softer, and Levin, listening but not answering and trying to mow the best he could, followed after Titus. They went some 100 steps. Titus kept on without stopping, without showing the slightest fatigue. but Levin was already beginning to fear that he would not hold out. He was so tired. He felt he was swinging with his last strength and decided to ask Titus to stop. But just then, Titus himself stopped and, bending down, took some grass, wiped the blade, and began to whet it. Levin straightened up and, taking a deep breath, looked behind. Behind him came a muzhik, and evidently he was also tired because he stopped at once before reaching Levin and began to whet. Titus whetted his and Levin's sides, and they went on. The second time it was all the same. Titus moved on, swing after swing, without pausing and without tiring. Levin followed him, trying not to lag behind and finding it harder and harder. There came a moment when he felt he had no strength left. But just then Titus stopped and whetted his sides. So they finished the first swath, and this long swath seemed especially hard to Levin. But then when the swath was finished and Titus, shouldering his sides, went back with slow steps over his own heel prints in the mowing, and Levin went back the same way over his own mowing, though sweat streamed down his face and dripped from his nose, and his back was all wet as if soaked with water, he felt very good. He rejoiced especially, knowing now he would hold out. I'm skipping a bit. Not understanding what it was or where it came from, in the midst of his work, he suddenly felt a pleasant sensation of coolness on his hot, sweaty shoulders. He glanced at the sky while his blade was being whetted. A low, heavy cloud had come over it, and big drops of rain were falling. Some muzhiks went for their kaftans and put them on. Others, like Levin, merely shrugged their shoulders joyfully under the pleasant freshness. They finished another swath and another. They went through long swaths, short swaths, with bad grass, with good grass. Levin lost all awareness of time and had no idea whether it was late or early. A change now began to take place in his work, which gave him enormous pleasure. In the midst of his work, moments came to him when he forgot what he was doing and began to feel light. And in those moments, his swath came out as even and good as Titus's. But as soon as he remembered what he was doing and started trying to do better, he at once felt how hard the work was, and the swath came out badly. I'm skipping again to 252. Levin went between them. In this hottest time, the mowing did not seem so hard to him. The sweat that drenched him cooled him off, and the sun, burning on his back, head and arm, with its sleeves rolled to the elbow, gave him firmness and perseverance in his work. More and more often, those moments of unconsciousness came, when it was possible for him not to think of what he was doing. The scythe cut by itself. These were happy moments. More joyful still were the moments when, coming to the river, where the swaths ended, the old man would wipe his scythe with thick, wet grass, rinse its steel in the cool water, dip his whetstone box, and offer it to Levin. "Have a sip of my kvass? Good, eh?" he said with a wink. And indeed, Levin had never before drunk such a drink as this warm water with green floating in it and tasting of the rusty tin box. And right after that came a blissfully slow walk with scythe in hand, during which he could wipe off the streaming sweat, fill his lungs with air, look at the whole stretched out line of mowers and at what was going on around him in the woods and fields. The longer Levin mowed, the more often he felt those moments of oblivion, during which it was no longer his arms that swung the scythe, but the scythe itself that lent motion to his whole body, full of life and conscious of itself. And as if by magic, without a thought of it, the work got rightly and neatly done on its own. These were the most blissful moments. And I'm skipping again to where they finished that field. Levin looked at 254. Levin looked around him and did not recognize the place. Everything was so changed. An enormous expanse of the meadow had been mowed, and its already fragrant swaths shone with a special new shine in the slanting rays of the evening sun. The mowed around bushes by the river itself, invisible before, but now shining like steel in its curves, the peasants stirring and getting up, the steep wall of grass at the unmowed side of the meadow, and the hawks wheeling above the bared meadow. All of this was completely new. Coming to his senses, Levin began to calculate how much had been mowed and how much more could be done that day. And I'm skipping to the next page. The sun was already low over the trees when, with whetstone boxes clanking, they entered the wooded gully of Mashka's knoll. The grass was waist high in the middle of the hollow, tender and soft, broad-bladed, speckled with cow wheat here and there under the trees. After a brief discussion to mow lengthwise or crosswise, Prokhor Yermilin, also a famous mower, a huge, swarthy man, went to the front. He finished the first swath, went back and moved over, and everybody started falling in line after him, going downhill through the hollow and up to the very edge of the wood. The sun sank behind the wood. The dew was already falling, and only those mowing on the hill were in the sun, while below, where the mist was rising and on the other side, they walked in the fresh, dewy shade. The work was in full swing. Sliced down with a succulent sound and smelling of spice, the grass lay in high swaths, crowding on all sides in the short swaths, their whetstones clanking to the noise of scythes clashing, of a whetstone swishing along a sharpening blade, and of merry shouts. The mowers urged each other on. So this is one of the great set pieces, and it's a famous passage in this book. It's very beautifully presented, and I want to draw your attention to a number of aspects. We talked a little before about the fact that mujiks or peasants or country people were not really addressed in 19th century literature except as the other. They were not part of the literary establishment. Education itself defined these two groups. If you were literate, you could write and you were comfortable reading and writing. If you were not literate, which many people were in the agricultural landscape, you were not part of it, and you didn't have friends who were writers. And so the writers often wrote about people in the landscape as romantic presences, or sometimes they were seen as lesser group of people. But Tolstoy enters into this group. This is a group that he feels very deeply connected to. And unlike other writers, Flaubert, for example, has a famous set piece. He has the agricultural fair, which makes fun of everyone involved. He has the peasant's wedding, or he has Emma's wedding, which is very much a country affair with lots of peasants in it. But Flaubert feels himself apart from this community. Tolstoy wants to enter this community. And as Levin, he is awkward, he's clumsy. He enters into it, he says, I'm going to do some mowing, and he hears laughter. And the mujiks know he's not going to be good because that's not what he does. And he's encroaching on their territory socially. So he's doing something that's very risky. Socially, he may make a fool of himself, which Levin does on many occasions. And he's also sort of trying to present himself as someone he's not, which is another big issue in this book. Yet the things that drive Levin to do this are deeply authentic. And you can see that in simply the description of the natural landscape, the intimate way that he understands grass, the smell of it, the spicy smell of it, the succulent sound of the scythes swishing through it, the movement of the scythe, the way it takes over your body, the way it makes you feel. We have a scythe, we have an old scythe out in the garage, and I now want to go out and heft it and see what that feels like and see if I can make it take over. We have 18 inches of snow, so I'm not going to do it right now, but there is this sense of intimate, visceral connection between Levin and this work, and a deep sense of humility, which is really another thing that 19th century literary characters, the writers that we know of the 19th century, humility and presenting themselves in a landscape, in a community where they were uncomfortable, was not something that we see much. of. And Tolstoy does this. Tolstoy is kind of headlong. We've talked before about the velocity of this text. So this is another way in which he demonstrates his headlong nature. He throws himself into a risky situation. His brother makes fun of him. He says, Brett, you're gonna go mowing? The mujiks laugh when he shows up. They say, watch out, master. Once you start, you can't stop. They know he's not gonna mow as well as they do. And he knows that. And he still wants to do it because of the great, here we come back to empathy, the great respect that Tolstoy has for this landscape and for the people who work on it. And the great respect Tolstoy has for physical labor. He doesn't really know how to quantify it, name it. But remember in that first scene when Levin comes to visit Stiva Oblonsky in his office, remember how he despises those long fingernails? And it's a comic scene because Levin is so out of place and so clumsy and so awkward. And Stiva smiles at him and says, I can see that you hate my colleague. He hates him because of those long fingernails, which demonstrate he might as well be wearing a placard around his neck saying, I will never do physical labor. I will never risk my beautiful tended hands. And Tolstoy is a man who believes in physical labor. He feels that it links you to life in a way that intellectual labor does not. Clearly, he's a man of intellect. Clearly, he's a man who is exploring ideas and intellectual possibilities all the time, but he will not give up his connection as a physical being on the landscape. And when he comes back to Yasnaya Polyana after he goes through his madcap years in which he nearly loses the entire place, he comes back sort of penniless and humbled. And that's when he learns to respect and dedicate himself to this place. So his connection to this place is of the soul as well as of the body. And in this passage, in this series of passages, he asks us to see this as a physical and a spiritual encounter. And it's really remarkable. It's very bold for 1875 in Russia. Remember, he's an aristocrat. Remember, it's not just his brother who's laughing at this idea. He's risking that every one of his readers thinks Levin is a fool because they're brought up to believe this is not what they do. Other people do this, they don't do it. So he's risking every literate reader, every one of his readers who is literate, they all are obviously, to mock him and to say, this is foolish, this is simply not done. And yet there is so much power, there is so much passion and dedication in this passage. And there is so much deep empathy for the land itself, the way the mist rises from that dewy passage down by the river, the way the river shines like a snake, the way the landscape is altered by the passage of these men carrying scythes, what the swaths do, every part of it he understands so intimately, and he records it with such affection. So just be aware of the deep, deep closeness that Tolstoy asks us to feel for this landscape and for the people who live on it and who perform the physical labor. And there's more, you've all read this whole section. So he goes on. And one of the things I like about this is I was telling my husband, I was having a hard time trying to find a passage or a few passages to read because there are 15 pages of this. And Tolstoy doesn't just say, Levin found it difficult in the beginning. He thought he was going to have to give up, but then by midday he was fine and he was friends with everybody. And then they mowed Mashka's knoll and goodbye and good night. He goes on, he asks you to follow in every single one of these passages where he's afraid he's going to fail, where he's proud of himself for succeeding, where he loses track of time, where he shares the meal of the mower next to him. All these things are so intimate and they bring us so deeply into this narrative. So with each one of these passages, Tolstoy is asking for our empathy as well as his own. Oh, and okay, so that's the mowing part. And he also, as we know, is thinking about the mujiks and thinking this is another theme that is present in the book. We know in the beginning he's been thinking about writing a book himself about the nature of the people who work the land in Russia and how this should be part of a sort of an economic strategy, and landowners should take into account the character of the people who work on it as they take into account the weather and the geological makeup of the earth itself. So this is something that interests him in a very deep and powerful way. So I'm going to move on to another passage that deals with another of the themes that we've been dealing with, and this is the family. And the last week we talked about that incredibly touching scene between Dolly and Kitty when the whole family is gathered around and the family is supporting Kitty, who has been devastated by Vronsky's treatment of her. So Tolstoy really believes that family is an enormously important part of life, and that it's something that he really didn't have. His mother died when he was 2, his father died when he was 8. So it's something he has a sort of a romantic notion of it, but he also wants to explore it in every detail as well. So we're going back to Dolly. This is on page 262, and then I'll skip a little. Yeah, I'll start on 262 and on 263. On Sunday, during St. Peter's, Daria Alexandrovna went to the liturgy and had all her children take communion. In her intimate philosophical conversations with her sister, mother, and friends, she very often surprised them with her free thinking in regard to religion. She had her own strange religion of metempsychosis, in which she firmly believed, that means that your soul will pass into another body when you've died, in which she firmly believed, caring little for the dogmas of the church. But in the family, she strictly fulfilled all the requirements of the church, not only to set an example, but with all her heart. And the fact that that the children had not received communion for more than a year troubled her greatly. And so, with Matryona's, Filimonovna's full approval and sympathy, she decided to do it now in the summer. Daria Alexandrovna thought about how to dress the children several days ahead of time. Dresses were made, altered, and washed. Seams and ruffles were let out. Buttons were sewn on and ribbons prepared. Only Tanya's dress, which the governess had undertaken to make, considerably soured Daria Alexandrovna's disposition. The governess, as she made the alterations, had taken tucks in the wrong places, cut the armholes too big, and all but ruined the dress. Tanya's shoulders were so tight it was painful to see. Matryona Filimonovna thought of putting in gussets and making a little pelerine, that's a little cape. That improved things, but there was nearly a quarrel with the governess. In the morning, however, everything was settled, and by 9 o'clock, the priest had been asked to wait till then with the liturgy. The dressed up children, radiant with joy, stood before the carriage at the porch, waiting for their mother. In place of the restive raven, that's a horse, though through Matryona Filimonovna's patronage, the steward's brownie horse was harnessed to the carriage, and Daria Alexandrovna, delayed by the cares of her toilette, came out in a white muslin dress to get in. Daria Alexandrovna had done her hair and dressed with care and excitement. Once she used to dress for herself, to be beautiful and admired. Then, the older she became, the more unpleasant it was for her to dress. She saw that she had lost her good looks. But now she again dressed with pleasure and excitement. Now she dressed not for herself, not for her own beauty, but so that, being the mother of these lovely things, she would not spoil the general impression. And taking a last look in the mirror, she remained satisfied with herself. She was pretty. Not as pretty as she had once wanted to be at a ball, but pretty enough for the purpose she now had in mind. There was no one in the church except some muzhiks, the caretakers and their women. But Darya Alexandrovna saw, or it seemed to her that she saw, the admiration aroused by her children and herself. The children were not only beautiful in their fine clothes, but were also sweet in behaving so well. True, Alyosha did not want to stand quite properly. He kept turning and wanted to see his jacket from behind. But all the same, he was remarkably sweet. Tanya stood like a big girl and looked after the little ones. But the smallest, Lily, was lovely with her naive surprise at everything. And it was hard not to smile when, after taking communion, she said in English, "Please, some more?" Returning home, the children felt that something solemn had taken place and were very quiet. So once again, we have Darya, Dolly, representing the notion of the family. Tolstoy brings in the church here, and we'll see the church as another sort of element of this book, but Tolstoy, again, can't decide quite how he feels about the church. He doesn't quite give it credit for the kind of power that it should have, it feels it has in Russian society. So he gives it some, and he's kind of confusing here. It's ambiguous. He says, in her family, Dolly strictly fulfills all the requirements of the church, not only to set an example, but with all her heart. That's despite the fact that she disregards the dogma of the church. But Tolstoy wants us to give a scene, create a scene in which there's a sense of deep stability because of the family itself. And as Tolstoy always does, he fills this scene with detail. So all those details about the gusset and the armholes being too big, and fixing it with the little pelerine, all those things are immediately familiar to anyone who has put clothes on children and wanted children to look their best. So he's giving us this scene in terms of Dolly and showing us her deep sense of tenderness for her children, her pride in them. Now, let's remember the fact that her husband is missing. Dolly is creating this family setting, this moment of solemnity, the family connection to a larger presence, the church. It's all done on her own. She is effectively a single mother. But here she takes such pleasure in what she has. She takes pleasure and pride in her children. And Tolstoy wants us to be aware of the fact that she was beautiful once. She is no longer beautiful, but she takes pride in presenting herself in harmony as a sort of a counterpoint to the beauty of her children. So he's creating this very rich tapestry of family entities, the little girl, Lily, the grown-up girl, Tanya, and Dolly's sense of herself as a proud participant, the creator of these children. But as we all know, we started the children, but we don't own them. And so she is bursting with a kind of maternal pride at the fact that they are all present in the world. They are, she thinks, beautiful. She thinks the whole world thinks they're beautiful, even though it's just the caretakers and their wives. She thinks they are all beaming at the sight of her children. So Tolstoy gives us this like a little flower inside this narrative, particularly the story of Dolly and her marriage. But he gives us this sense of her pride and her delight and the happiness that she has created, despite the fact that we know her marriage has failed. So, so there's that part of the marriage theme. And then I want to read another part of the marriage theme. So this is, we go back to Levin, and he can't figure out what his relationship is to the mujiks, to the people who work the land that he owns. His wet nurse was a mujik, so he feels deeply physically connected to these people. He had an affair with a mujik's wife. He has a child by her. His father did the same thing. So he has illegitimate cousins and relatives on the property. That's something that causes him a kind of shame and a fascination. So there are all kinds of strands that connect Tolstoy to this community. And the fact that he has entered into this physical process of mowing the fields and standing behind the leader of the mujiks. He does not lead this line. He stands behind the leader. So he is uncertain as to what his relationship is. He's uncertain as to what his position is here. And he loves this scene, this passage in which he mows with the mujiks. And now I'll read from page 274 at the end of this. And he's been mowing with an older man and a younger man called Mishka. No, sorry, this is Ivan Parmenov. Levin looked more attentively at Ivan Parmenov and his wife. And this is a fine young fellow who's been married for 2 years. And he's been talking to Ivan's father. And Levin says, "What about children?" And his father says, "Children, ha." For a whole year, he understood nothing and was bashful besides. The old man replied, "Ah, what hay, just like tea," he repeated, wishing to change the subject. There's again that sensuous appreciation of the landscape, that how juicy and fresh and tender and soft the grass is and how it smells. Then Levin looked more attentively at Ivan Parmenov and his wife. They were loading a haystack not far from him. Ivan Parmenov stood on the cart, receiving, spreading, and stamping down the enormous loads of hay that his young beauty of a wife deftly heaved up to him, first in armfuls and then on the fork. The young woman worked easily, cheerfully, and skillfully. The thick, packed down hay would not go right on the fork. She first loosened it up, stuck the fork in, then leaned the whole weight of her body on it with a supple and quick movement, and straightening up at once, curving her back, tightly girded with a red sash, her full breasts showing under the white smock, deftly shifted her grip on the fork and heaved the load high up onto the cart. Ivan, obviously trying to spare her every moment of extra work, hastily picked up the load pitched to him in his wide open arms and spread it on the cart. After pitching him the last of the hay on a rake, the woman shook off the hay dust that had got on her neck, straightened the red kerchief that had gone askew on her white, untanned forehead, and went under the cart to tie down the load. Ivan showed her how to loop it under the axletree and burst into loud laughter at something she said. Strong, young, recently awakened love showed in the expression on both their faces. So Levin is watching this entranced. He's an outsider, but he's such a perceptive observer. And he loves this notion of shared affection and erotic charge, the sense of marriage in this landscape, marriage between two people who are working on the landscape. And in his book, The Cossacks, which is one of the first books that brought him national attention, he explores that notion. The Cossacks was written based on his experience in Chechnya and the Caucasus, when he is in an ethnic situation that's impossible for me to describe. But anyway, there are lots of different ethnic groups, and he becomes friends with a certain party, a certain village where he's living. And he falls sort of in love with a beautiful young woman from that community. And this young officer from Moscow asks her to marry him. And she laughs at him, says, "People like you don't ask people like me to marry." And he doesn't marry her, but there's this sense of possibility, this sense of risk and the glamour of somebody from a completely different community, a community that is very sure of itself, very confident, very beautiful, very effective, very powerful in their own place. So this draws Levin, this idea, maybe he should marry into this community. Maybe he should take a wife who's a peasant. And that because he's so solitary during this mowing, his brother doesn't understand anything he's doing. He doesn't really talk to the musics. So all this is going on in his mind. And then the next morning, he walks, he stays up all night, more or less, with the musics. And then the next morning, he's walking home and there's an apparition. This is on page 277. A slight breeze sprang up and it turned gray and gloomy. The bleak moment came that usually precedes dawn, the full victory of light over darkness. Hunched up with cold, Levin walked quickly, his eyes on the ground. What's that? Someone's coming, he thought, hearing bells, and he raised his head. Remember, as I've said before, this is pre-industrial revolution, pre-engines. So the sounds that we hear in this landscape are all natural. And the way you know that a carriage is coming is that you hear the bells from a distance. And after this carriage passes him, he can hear that it has entered the village. And the way he knows that is because he hears the dogs start barking in the village. So that the way understanding is brought to you at this period is completely different from the way we perceive things today. Combustion engines, no combustion engines. Hearing bells, what's that? Someone's coming, he thought, hearing bells, and he raised his head. 40 paces away from him, on the grassy main road down which he was walking, a coach and four with leather trunks on the roof came driving towards him. The shaft horses pressed towards the shafts, away from the ruts, but the adroit driver, sitting sideways on the box, guided the shafts along the ruts so that the wheels ran over the smooth ground. That was the only thing Levin noticed, and without thinking who it might be, he glanced absent-mindedly into the coach. Inside the coach, an old lady dozed in the corner, and a young girl, apparently just awakened, sat by the window, holding the ribbons of her white bonnet with both hands. Bright and thoughtful, all filled with a graceful and complex inner life to which Levin was a stranger, she looked through him at the glowing sunrise. At the very instant when this vision was about to vanish, the truthful eyes looked at him. She recognized him, and astonished joy lit up her face. He could not have been mistaken. There were no other eyes in the world like those. There was no other being in the world capable of concentrating for him all the light and meaning of his life. It was she. It was Kitty. He realized that she was driving to Yergushovo from the railway station. That's her sister Dolly's estate. And all that had troubled Levin during that sleepless night, all the decisions he had taken, all of it suddenly vanished. He recalled with disgust his dreams of marrying a peasant woman. There in that carriage, quickly moving away and bearing to the other side of the road, was the only possibility of resolving the riddle of his life that had been weighing on him so painfully of late. So once again, Tolstoy is offering us a vision. This is an apparition. It's hallucinatory, the way Kitty suddenly appears at this moment when he spent the whole night listening to the mujiks sing songs and drink kvass and generally celebrate the harvest. And so he's deeply embedded in this notion of peasant life, and he's out in the fields and there are haystacks all around. And then, so he's thinking, he's imagining that that's really a possibility for him. He could celebrate this life and just go into that for good and cast off the rest of his life. And remember that Tolstoy, at a certain point, stopped wearing European clothes. Remember that Petersburg and the idea of Europe was a big sort of dividing line in Russian culture. And we've been noticing all the references to kaftans and tiger skin rugs, all those things that represent Asia. But Peter the Great started everybody wearing European clothes. But Tolstoy at a certain point in his life, stopped wearing European clothes. And he started using only the peasant shirt, which is a shirt that we all know well, with a high collar and the buttons on one side and full sleeves. And he wore that really for the rest of his life. He just decided that he was going to relate to the landscape and the people on it more than he was going to relate himself to the literary tribe of Moscow. So this was a theme that he explored for the rest of his life. But at this moment, as he's considering that as a real possibility, like Deus Ex Machina, suddenly the love of his life appears as in a dream. He hears the bells, and then he sees the horses, and he looks in, and there is Kitty Sherbatsky, the woman he wants to marry. And that shifts him. That's one of those movements in life that transforms the path that you're going to take. So he shifts back onto the path that is going to lead him to Kitty. And again, we see marriage as being central. It's a theme that is revisited over and over in this book in many ways. And the last passage I will read is Anna. This is on page 287. Though Anna had stubbornly and bitterly persisted in contradicting Vronsky when he told her that her situation was impossible and tried to persuade her to reveal everything to her husband, in the depths of her soul, she considered her situation false, dishonest, and wished with all her soul to change it. Coming home from the races with her husband, in a moment of agitation, she had told him everything, despite the pain she had felt in doing so. She was glad of it. After her husband left, she told herself that she was glad, that now everything would be definite, and at least there would be no falsehood and deceit. It seemed unquestionable to her that now her situation would be defined forever. It might be bad, this new situation, but it would be definite. There would be no vagueness or falsehood in it. The pain she had caused herself and her husband by uttering those words would be recompensed by the fact that everything would be defined, she thought. That same evening, she saw Vronsky, but did not tell him about what had happened between her and her husband, though to clarify the situation, she ought to have told him. When she woke up the next morning, the first thing that came to her was the words that she had spoken to her husband. And they seemed now so terrible that she could not understand how she could have resolved to utter those strange, coarse words and could not imagine what would come of it. But the words had been spoken, and Alexei Alexandrovich had left without saying anything. I saw Vronsky and didn't tell him. Even at the very moment he was leaving, I wanted to call him back and tell him, but I changed my mind because it was strange that I hadn't told him at the very first moment. Why didn't I tell him if I wanted to? And in answer to this question, a hot flush of shame poured over her face. She understood what had kept her from doing it. She understood that she was ashamed. Her situation, which had seemed clarified last night, now suddenly appeared to her not only not clarified, but hopeless. She became terrified of the disgrace, which she had not even thought of before. When she merely thought of what her husband was going to do, the most terrible notion came to her. It occurred to her that the accountant would now come to turn her out of the house, that her disgrace would be announced to the whole world. She asked herself where she would go when she was turned out of the house, and she could find no answer. When she thought of Vronsky, she imagined that he did not love her, that he was already beginning to be burdened by her, that she could not offer herself to him, and she felt hostile to him because of it. It seemed to her that the words she had spoken to her husband, and which she kept repeating in her imagination, had been spoken to everyone, and that everyone had heard them. She could not bring herself to look into the eyes of those she lived with. She could not bring herself to call her maid, and still less to go downstairs to see her son and the governess. I'm skipping down. Anna did not begin to dress. She went on sitting in the same position, her head and arms hanging down, and every once in a while, her whole body shuddered, as if wishing to make some gesture, to say something, and then become still again. She kept repeating, my God, but neither the my nor the God had any meaning for her. Though she had never doubted the religion in which she had been brought up, the thought of seeking help from religion and her situation was as foreign to her as seeking help from Alexei Alexandrovich. She knew beforehand that the help of religion was possible only on condition of renouncing all that made up the whole meaning of life for her. Not only was it painful for her, but she was beginning to feel fear before the new, never experienced state of her soul. She felt that everything was beginning to go double in her soul, as an object sometimes goes double to tired eyes. Sometimes she did not know what she feared, what she desired, whether she feared or desired what had been or what would be, and precisely what she desired she did not know. Ah, what am I doing? She said to herself, suddenly feeling pain in both sides of her head. When she came to herself, she saw that she was clutching the hair on her temples and squeezing them with both hands. She jumped up and began pacing. And I'm skipping to page 290. She stopped and looked at the tops of the aspens swaying in the wind, their washed leaves glistening brightly in the cold sun. And she understood that they would not forgive her, that everything and everyone would be merciless to her now, like this sky, like this greenery. And again, she felt things beginning to go double in her soul. I mustn't think, she said to herself. I must get ready to go. Where? When? Whom shall I take with me? Yes, to Moscow on the evening train. Anushka and Seryosha, and only the most necessary things. So this passage, we talked before about velocity in this book, how headlong the narrative is, and Virginia Pye raised the question of interiority, how there's velocity despite the fact that many of these passages take place inside someone's mind. And so our initial feeling is you can't have velocity if there's just somebody thinking. But Tolstoy makes it happen so that in Anna's mind, there is such a feeling of urgency and intensity, and her situation is so dire that we enter into this passage in which her feelings swing wildly back and forth. And we absolutely believe what she's going through. Tolstoy makes us understand that her situation is utterly dire. There is the possibility that her husband will have her thrown out of her house. We haven't gotten there yet, but Anna has no family. She didn't have her mother died too when she was young. She was married off by an aunt to an older man, Karenina. So she doesn't have the support group that the other people in this book have. Stiva has she has Stiva, sorry, but Stiva is a frail reed. The Sherbetsky family is very tightly knit, and you have the feeling they will all protect each other. Anna doesn't not have that sense of protection. And what she is doing, she's afraid is going to set her outside the walls of the community, that no one will protect her, no one will help her. And the idea of being thrown out of her own house is really terrifying. She knows that the church will not support her and the law will not support her. And she can't believe what she's done. And we knew in the very beginning that Anna is a moral woman. She's a woman of integrity. She hates deception. She hates falsehood. That's one reason she confessed to her husband about this. But she has now put herself in a situation in which there is no moral position. She is a married woman who has made a declaration of an illicit liaison, which is against the law and it's against the church. And when Tolstoy says this thing, that things go double in her soul, this is a terrifying suggestion, and it's something that we will see repeated. And it suggests that Anna has reached a place at which she can no longer reconcile her integrity with her life. And integrity is something that Tolstoy takes very seriously. The idea of authenticity, the idea of living a life that you are proud of. So Anna has reached a point in which we sense a moral peril for her. As we are examining this, this theme of marriage, as we're moving through the narrative, I want to remind you of the opening scene in this book. The famous line, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And remember the velocity of that opening scene, in which we read at a speed of 150 miles an hour. Stiva, the husband, had an affair with the former governess. The cook has quit. The children are running around. The wife has not spoken to him for 3 days. It's almost comic, the way this scene is delivered to us, in the rapidity, the velocity, the intensity of it. And also, we don't take Stiva very seriously. As we remember, he wasn't really sorry that he'd had the affair. He was sorry that his wife found out about it. And Dolly is very sympathetic. She's devastated by what's happened. That we understand from Stiva that he's never going to be the man for Dolly. He's never going to have the moral backbone to respond to her in a way that would make her marriage whole again. So this is the family that starts off the book, this nearly comic scene in which adultery is revealed and the family is splintered because of it. And it's a wonderful opening, full of energy, full of this near comic notion. It presents to us the sense of family being important, being shattered. So remember, Donald Kimmelman raised the point of discussing the scene between Levin and Stiva, when Stephen comes out to buy the wood, or to sell the wood on Dolly's estate, and he sells it to a local merchant. And Donald said, what is that? Let's talk about that. And I think I would suggest that is paired. It's a kind of, it's a twin of the scene in the beginning when Levin comes to Stiva's office, his place of work. So at Stiva's place of work, Levin is awkward, uncomfortable. He doesn't understand what Steve is doing. He doesn't put any stock in it. He's contemptuous of it. He comes in the wrong door. He despises the fingernails. And Stiva is very good-natured. Stiva is actually very, very good at his job. He's very effective, very responsible. We respect him for that. And it's Levin who's the outlier, who doesn't know how to make things work and who stumbles and does everything wrong. This is that scene with Levin and Stiva at Levin's place is the opposite, or the counterpart of that. Levin knows what's going on. Levin knows Stiva's making a mistake. Levin gives him advice, and Stiva has no idea what he's doing. So Tolstoy does this throughout the book. There are paired scenes that show us one version of a subject and then the other. So with this, we open with this brilliant scene, the famous scene in which we're allowed to enter into the life of a family without taking it too much to heart. It's painful to see Dolly's grief, and we can't help but sympathize with Stiva because he's so good-natured and because he doesn't want to hurt anyone. He's not a cruel person. So we're sort of asked to sympathize with this, but we're not allowed to take it very seriously. And so Stiva and Dolly's marriage opens the book. And it's Anna and Karenina's marriage that draws us more deeply into this theme and makes us enter in a much more complex and challenging way. So that Karenina, who at first is almost comic like Stiva, he's cold, he's stiff, he seems very superficial, he's facetious, he's cruel to Anna really by being so facetious. And Anna is beautiful, she is generous. The way we first meet her is evidence of her generosity both to her brother and to Vronsky's mother. So these people are much more serious, and Karenina has much more power over Anna than Dolly and Stiva have over each other. These are relationships that are based on much more complicated and deep connections than the ones between Dolly and Stiva. Once we enter into Anna and Karenina's marriage and the relationship between Anna and Vronsky, we are in very deep waters indeed. We're asked to consider the most powerful kinds of emotional bonds, erotic charge, feelings of loyalty, feelings of shame and honor. So this is another pairing in which Tolstoy shows us one kind of marriage and then proposes another kind of marriage, which both deepens our understanding of the theme and also engages us with another's, well, it's a triangle with another marriage and the threat to that marriage. So I am going to leave you for 1 second. I realize I forgot my light and it's getting darker and darker. I'm going to run into the next room and get it. And I hope you prepare some questions for me. So now I have my light, and Sherry, could you unmute people so that we have a chance to there?
Sure thing, I'll do that right now.
So let me just while we're doing that, some people have suggested that I ask people to submit questions beforehand. I'm very happy to do that. If anybody wants to write to the library, write on that link and send in a question, I'd be happy to receive it. Since we're such a large group, I can't promise to answer every question, but I'm happy to look at them beforehand. And I can look at the chat.
I just wanted to mention that everyone should be able to unmute themselves now, but unless you are asking a question, please stay muted just so we can avoid any background noise. Thank you.
Are you open for questions now?
I'm open for questions.
Okay. So I sort of would like to talk about Varenka. And
Yeah. Oh, yes. Sorry. I just left that whole scene out because I couldn't figure out what little nugget to take from it. Good. Let's talk about Varenka.
So, well, what's interesting to me is how Tolstoy uses an event or a person to bring out the personality of somebody else. I mean, certainly last week with the horse race and the disaster of that, and the comments that were made about him kicking the horse, and was that related to the pregnancy? But certainly related to not being respectful. It showed us an aspect of Vronsky that was a really unpleasant aspect of him. So then you have Kitty meeting Varenka in this spa, and Varenka is beautiful and she's committed and she's serious. And Kitty, at this point, I'm not even clear, frankly, why Levin is in love with her, other than her being physically beautiful. But she's a little bit of she's a lightweight. She's in her pink bedroom and et cetera. And she meets this woman, Varenka, who is independent and has, again, that kind of commitment. And it makes Kitty, I think, pause to think about, well, maybe I need to be a different kind of person. You've mentioned how Tolstoy really talks about what can I be to be the person I want to be. You mentioned that another time, and Varenka seems to play that role with Kitty. I don't know whether she appears again because I haven't read this since college, but I'd wonder whether you want to comment.
So I'm glad you brought this up. Oh, and also just let me remind you, one question to a person. But So I'm glad you brought this up. The whole question of the German spy is really interesting. And I would just start out before we get to Varenka, just to say, to remind you that the whole idea of Europe is a complicated one in Russia of this period, because everyone in the aristocracy, as we know, can speak French. They're expected to speak French, and they use Europe as a kind of an alternative space. So it's the place that they send Kitty to get better. There's a reference to a woman who lives in Nice and sells her property. So it's a place that people go to be not in Russia, but it makes them uncomfortable. So Kitty's mother, who is a Russian lady, wants to pretend that she's a European lady if she's in Europe, which Tolstoy says is impossible because she's Russian. And there's a social hierarchy there. She makes sure that they are set, they start out in the right place in terms of the rest of the people there. But my sense of this whole passage of the Sherbatskys at the spa is that it's about authenticity. And you're right, we don't have much of a sense of Kitty before then. We have the sense that she's an eager, charming young girl. She's not really given a place in society, but that's why I said that one of the themes of this book is how to lead your life as a man, and Tolstoy, but not as a woman. There's really only one way to lead your life as a woman in this book. Tolstoy gives us 4 men, different possibilities. We've got Stiva, who is a good bureaucrat, completely irresponsible emotionally. We have Levin, terrible bureaucrat, an emotional pilgrim. Vronsky, a man of honor in some ways, and in some ways not, military. Karenina, a bureaucrat who seems completely devoid of emotion, but we learn that he has this emotional furnace inside him. But they all have different places in the world. Vronsky's a soldier, Steve. The women are all really expected to be wives and mothers. And we will get later to some intellectual development, but Tolstoy really has this he really wants women to be wonderful wives and mothers and to fulfill that role in a way that's magnificent. Not that he demeans them, but that's really all he expects from them. So Kitty, you're right, we haven't seen a lot of intellectual presence from her, but she also is seen, I think, as a very sympathetic character. And the way she treats Levin in the beginning and realizes he's in love with her, doesn't want to hurt him. I think she's very sympathetic. But in Germany, we have this sort of coming to grips with reality. So Kitty goes there feeling that she's been humiliated. She can never raise her head again in society. Her role has been destroyed. She was a beautiful young woman with a great success. And then the man has humiliated her. Everyone in Russia has seen that. And she comes to Germany and sees, as you say, first there's a different kind of role that she can play. She learns this from Varenka. But then the real thing that happens in Germany, it seems to me, is that all this notion of inauthentic behavior is exploded by her father. So she comes there thinking that she's in a new world, that there's a new way to behave. Varenka actually is that person, and I can't remember if we learned her background now or not, but she has no role in society unless she is nice to this woman, Madame Stahl. But that's not Kitty's role. And Kitty has been making herself into someone that she wasn't, just as Madame Stahl has made herself into someone she wasn't. And so Tolstoy has suggested that the doctors are charlatans. Basically, they said that what Kitty had could be cured with Poland water, and that she should, drink liquids 4 times a day, and then she would be fine, and she should go to Europe. And her father is against all of that. Her father doesn't think the doctors have any meaning. Tolstoy doesn't really have much respect for doctors. So the whole thing is a kind of a made up a kerfuffle over nothing. And she's brought back, her father is the one that reveals all of this to her. And she comes back to Russia a whole person. She's no longer trying to be somebody else that she isn't in a foreign place among people who are not themselves. She comes home renewed. So that's the way I understand it.
So if I could follow up directly on that, you talk about the parallels, the infidelities in the two households and how they're treated differently. The Levin, Steve, the two scenes. I thought it was interesting in this, and it was amazing. We're talking about 100 pages. So much takes place in every 100 pages. You can't cover it all in your 1 hour, Roxana. Here you have the case of Kitty sort of imagining this other person for herself. She's going to be this selfless creature who serves people, a noble person, maybe never marry, who knows. And then her father comes and she snaps out of it. And meanwhile, you have Levin, with his romance for the peasants, getting to the point where he's looking at this beautiful peasant girl and said, maybe that's the way I should go. I should marry a peasant girl, live like a peasant. And then he sees Kitty and he snaps out of it. And so we've set them both up to actually find each other at this point.
Really good point. That's exactly right. Yeah. Someone else? A question or something we should discuss?
I have something I'd like you to speak to, if you would.
Yes.
I don't know what the Russian word is that the translation is coming from, but there's so many moments when Tolstoy uses the word joy. The face lights up with joy, the eyes light up with joy. There's joy with the peasants. There's joy, joy with the family. And joy isn't a word we hear a lot of. So I'm wondering if you could speak to Tolstoy's embrace of joy.
That's a great question. And when I teach this at Hunter to my graduate students, I always have to raise the question of the word soul, which is just so much not used nowadays. It's not a concept that we are used to thinking about. It's not current, but it's very important to Tolstoy, and soul is used over and over. And Anna is to the depths of her soul, she's ashamed, and Kitty is joyful in her soul. And so the way I read this is that Tolstoy, we talked in the very beginning of this about passion and emotion, and how powerful they are in this book, that they are the real engines. I would say this is not a novel of ideas. Well, not that it isn't, it also is, but for people who separate novels into novels of ideas and not novels of emotions, I would say Tolstoy is driven by emotions. And there's so many moments in this book when people clasp each other and kiss and hug and weep. Those emotions are so freely expressed, so freely felt, that I think Tolstoy is existing, and he wants to say that Russia exists in a world that is more highly colored emotionally than we are used to. Maybe we all felt like that in the 1870s. Maybe Americans felt the same way, but they didn't write that way. And so one of the things that Tolstoy does is loose the bonds of emotion so that we are expected to feel great joy, great grief, great shame. These are the depths of emotion that Tolstoy puts us through all the time. And that's part of the velocity, this feeling of emotions being very available to everyone. And we are asked to feel them with these characters constantly. So as Donald says, we are hurtling through the passages of these people's lives. But it all feels so rapid because we all engage in these emotions that are so strong. But I'm glad you raised that. Yeah, it's great.
This is Mike Hess. Can I make a comment and ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, these are related. I have a lot of relatives in Germany who are constantly going on what they call a Kur, K-U-R. And there are places in Germany that start with the name Bad, B-A-D, like Bad Reichenau, Bad Tolz, and so on. So the idea is that you go there to recover, whether emotionally or from an illness and so on. But Germany is well known for these bads. So is that why? So that's the statement. Here comes the question. Do you think that's why specifically Germany was selected as a place for Kitty to go to, as opposed to, I don't know, France, Austria, or Hungary, let's say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, Germany is famous for them. Last year, Marienbad is probably the most famous for all of us. But yes, Germany did spas very, very well. And there were spas there were hot springs and mineral springs in Russia. But as I say, it was more elegant and more sophisticated to go to Europe for these things. And Germany was absolutely famous, and it was a place to recover. So people would go, French people would go there for their liver. Russians, here's Kitty who goes for an imagined tubercular condition. So you're right, it had this, it took on this role of just health and recovery.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
This is Lynn Mattoon. I'm a little puzzled, Roxana, by the credit you give to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the credit you give to Stiva for being such a good bureaucrat. I mean, it seems to me that almost Tolstoy is sort of satirizing his job on 259 when he talks about Stiva going back to work to Petersburg, and the main thing he has to do is remind the ministry of himself. I mean, just to be there. And it seems like a certain class of person like Stiva can get a job in the bureaucracy, and that will give him an income. And then you angle for a somewhat better job by having the right connections, which he does later. So it doesn't seem that he's that competent. It's just that he knows the right people and he behaves in the right way.
Those things are true. He is part of that circle, and Tolstoy makes that clear. But if you read the opening section, when Levin comes to stay with him, he is dignified, he is respectful, he's effective. He maintains a respectful tone in the office. When somebody makes a joke, he makes it clear, a disrespectful joke, he makes clear from his response that that's not tolerated there. He listens to the petitioners all the way through. He explains where they should go next. He writes down on a piece of paper a place for them to go. He is very good at his job. We're taught that in the very beginning. Everything else you say is true. He is part of a circle in society where you get jobs like that, and then he wants one that pays more. But we're not told that he's irresponsible or rude or.
No, I didn't mean that. I just meant that it's not that he accomplishes that much.
Well, that's not his fault. That's the bureau. He's in a ministry. Tolstoy doesn't even bother to identify it. I don't know what it is, but what he is meant to do, he does, and he does it very effectively and responsibly. So he's a curious amalgam. He's emotionally irresponsible, but professionally he's very responsible. There was a wonderful definition of sentimentality that I liked, which is emotion without responsibility. So that the easy tear at a little girl crying over her puppy is sentimental, but and that's really Stiva. He feels emotion without taking any responsibility for it. But he's not, so he's that person. But in his office, he's excellent. He's excellent.
Roxana, this is Grace Harvey.
Yeah.
Yes, and he's so likable, and he's so unaccountable for his actions. So you compare him to Anna and, his sister. And it seems that Anna is placed in this universe all by herself because she has such integrity. She has such morality. And you think about Betsy, or all the dalliances that are taking place throughout that aristocratic group. And that Anna throughout is just it just destroys her.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you say.
Kind of makes me mad that Stiva is presented as so likable. I mean, you'd much rather probably spend a day with Stiva than Anna. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Tolstoy will not let us take the easy way out and dismiss Stiva as a villain. He's not. He's very charming, and he loves his children, and he loves Dolly. He just wants to have somebody on the side. So Tolstoy just makes these characters complex and makes them ones that we can't turn away from. And you're absolutely right. And those are another two pairs of things that we're asked to to look at side by side. We have Steva's adultery and we have Anna's adultery, brother and sister. And Steva's not going to get thrown out of the house. The house is his.
Amazing. Could I ask a question? Or you have,
Yeah.
they're written ones as well, but maybe this is better for next time, but it has to do with the fact that the serfs were freed in 1861, and this takes place, I guess, shortly, not too long afterwards. And you know, all the way that Levin loves the peasants, and also the whole goes into the great detail about the land reform and how best to, you know, use the peasant productivity and to make them happy and all that. And it's it has to do with that, right? That the slave, I mean, the serfs were, you know, their situation changed right at this moment. So it sort of has a whole political element as well to this. And I just wonder what you think about that, and sort of how Levin fits into a sort of more progressive approach to, you know, to the Russian peasantry.
Absolutely right. The book is written in 1870, around 1874 to 77. So it was almost 15 years after the emancipation. And there was a huge amount of turmoil in Russia, as you can imagine, because like the American South, all of a sudden, all the landowners lost their free labor. And that's, as we talked a little bit about that, how that's why they started selling off the forests, selling off the trees. And I can't remember if I've talked about this before, but Chekhov was aware of this and talked about the destruction of the forests. And the Russian taiga, which goes across the top of Russia, is one of the great boreal forests on the planet. So cutting them all down because of the emancipation of the serfs was an ecological disaster. But yes, this was very political, and Tolstoy himself was involved in this. And as we know, Levin wanted to write a book about this subject and how to deal with the people working on the land, the mujiks. Nobody could really figure it out, and that there were mujiks who, Tolstoy went through something that, like what he describes Levin doing. I think we haven't come to that yet, but he devises a plan by which they will share in the crops, and they'll give him some money. And there are a lot of conservative mujiks who have been exploited by people for generations, who don't trust anything that he says, and they don't want anything to do with it. He says, no, you're going to own this. It's a different way of payment. They say, we know what you're trying to do, but we're not buying that. So it was a period of enormous disturbance politically, and who's to say whether Russia has figured it out, or if anyone has had, who should own the land and who should work it. It's a big question that is still present with us today. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of political disturbance in this book that Tolstoy deals with.
Roxana, Linda English here in New London.
Linda.
I have a question. Well, it's more of a comment that I'd like you to weigh in on. I love how people slip into French. Show of hands who took high school French here. But there's this great passage where Levin really sort of puts down the use of French when one of Dolly's children comes in. I think it's on, yeah, I forget what page it's on. And he more or less says, you know, this is a little unnatural, and kind of, you know, weighs in and says, you know, you shouldn't have done that, really. You want to comment on that piece?
Yeah, so I think the one you're talking about is when her daughter comes in and asks in French for a shovel. She asked for a shovel, and she says the word shovel in Russian, and her mother says, I'm speaking French, you should speak French. And she says, I couldn't remember the word for shovel. And Tolstoy, Levin finds that deeply unnatural, inauthentic. And as we know, for Tolstoy, inauthentic is a bad word. But let me remind you that when he first is in love with Kitty, and we are learning about the Sherbatskys, one of the things he loves about the Sherbatskys is that they know all these social rules, and that they know that their daughters should have their skirts at this length, and that they should go out on the promenade at this time in the afternoon, and that they should speak French on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays. He loves that because they live in an orderly world that is connected in a very peaceable and effective way with the rest of the social world. And he doesn't have any access to that. So he finds it very comforting in the beginning. At this point, Dolly is trying to persuade him to reconnect with Kitty. He has been humiliated, as Kitty was humiliated by Vronsky. He was humiliated by Kitty. It's another twinning. And he now hates everything Dolly does. So because he's in this situation, now everything she does seems false to him. But that's why what I was saying when I say the Russian relationship to Europe is very complicated and full of ambivalence. They both love it. The aristocrats love knowing languages. They have tutors for their children. They all learn German and French and English. And to be a well-bred aristocrat in Russian, that's what you did. On the other hand, they are Russian and they believe in their own culture. So it's hard for them to figure out, as Volokhonsky said, before the 19th century, there was no real Russian literature. They didn't even know what language to write in. So this notion of French and speaking French was complicated. And there were people who felt that it elevated them to do it. And there were people who felt that it was contemptuous of their own heritage to do it. And Tolstoy, like as with everything else, Tolstoy goes back and forth on this.
Merci beaucoup.
What? So here's a question. The stream of consciousness of the character is expressed by using the same marks as the speaker. I am not sure what that means. Carrie Noble, do you want to elaborate? Can you unmute Carrie Noble?
Yes. I'm interested in the fact that the same marks, in the sense that the parentheses, we usually use in our text, we use, like 2 for when it's the speaker and 1 when it's the interior voice.
You mean quotation marks?
Yeah, yes. And so in Tolstoy, he's using basically the same single mark. But I'm also interested, that's a technical issue, but do you think that he's writing well about the interior voice? Using whatever technique he needs to do, but do you appreciate the stream of consciousness, and is it clear to us?
About the quotation marks, this is a European habit, really, of using single marks instead of double. So that I think that's what they're referring to. That he's not doing anything tricky. It's just what you're used to. If you're used to single or double. For me, the stream of consciousness works beautifully. And as I said earlier, this is a pre-modernist characteristic of Tolstoy's writing, and because he enters so deeply into somebody's mind, we are given a preview of what Virginia Woolf and Proust and Joyce would do later, more vividly, and which would take over the text in a way that his doesn't. But for me, the stream of consciousness works very powerfully and effectively. I don't know about the rest of you, but for me it is.
Thank you.
Boredom. So someone asks about boredom. So I can't remember if I talked about this in this class, but there is a word in Russian called kalaksnost. I forget what it is exactly. I don't speak Russian, but it means dressing gownness. And it is, it's only a Russian word. We don't have it, but it means that you feel too filled with boredom and ennui to actually get dressed and do anything. And I find it a fascinating concept. I don't know whether it's the result of authoritarian regimes, which Russia has sort of been enamored of for centuries, or whether it's something else, whether it's something in the soil. But the idea of boredom is really a part of Russian consciousness. And I can't explain it. I can't explain its derivation, but it's certainly present. I don't think it's present much in this book. I don't think Tolstoy has time for it. It doesn't fill up a page if you're bored, but it's part of that Russian culture, is people sort of giving up.
Roxana,
Yeah.
it seems to me that Tolstoy is really interested in work.
Oh, yes.
Maybe you could talk a
Yes.
little bit about work.
Thank you. I'm glad you raised that. He's hugely interested in work. And so, like everything else, he is ambivalent about it. We understand that when we listen to him, where we see him in situations when he's talking to intellectuals, the philosophers, the political philosophers, he gets bored and inattentive very quickly. And when he listens to his brother, Sergei, it's a brilliant exchange that shows you people who don't understand each other on any level at all. And the words are almost useless. And Tolstoy does that so tellingly, showing us what Levin is thinking and what he's saying to Sergei, and how Sergei is talking to him on one level and he will never understand what Levin means. And Levin is going to be proven to be wrong no matter what he says. So you have him thinking about the way people interact, but he's also talking about work, and his brother is an absolute intellectual, and Levin doesn't really have patience for that, but he respects it as a kind of work. He rejects Steva's kind of work and the bureaucrats' work. He doesn't have much respect for Karenina, but he respects those two men as men who are doing their parts. He respects Vronsky for doing his part. We believe that he is good at his job. All the men in his platoon love him. He takes responsibility for them. But then the moment when we see Levin doing something that he can say unashamedly is work, it's a very different kind of world. And those passages that I read show this enormous respect for this kind of work. He doesn't give himself any respect, Levin, for the work he's doing. Remember, he's trying to write a book about farming and the peasants. We don't really hear much about that. We don't understand how much time he spends at it. So it's really interesting, since Tolstoy is a man who wrote a huge amount and many very long books. That's not the work he describes. And he describes this physical labor as the kind that is given the most glory and celebrated the most highly in this text. But the idea of work is part of how shall I live my life as a man. It's not something that the women are asked to consider, but the men are each asked to show the kind of work that they do. And we're asked to consider that as readers and to judge them. But it's a really important concept in this book. I'm glad you raised it. So we are nearly out of time. Is there one last question? No. Okay. So thank you all for coming to journey through Anna Karenina with me. I enjoy your comments and your presence, and send your questions next week to the library if you would like them considered, and have fun with Anna. I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. Thank you, Margaret.